Om Shanti. Good evening. And welcome to this interview with the Raj Yogi. Our topic in this session is spirituality in everyday life, and this is part 2 of that topic. And as usual, we'll start with a reflection. In just one thought, I can move from the visible to the invisible. From the outer world to the inner world. I interact with the outer world largely through the physical senses. What the physical eyes see, what the physical ears hear. And this can impact my inner world. The thoughts in the mind, the perspectives, the attitudes. It might lead me to believe that everything depends on what's going on in the outer world. But if I look more closely, slow things down, I might discover the exact opposite is true. That it doesn't move from the visible to the invisible, but from the invisible to the visible. The outer world is not really shaping my thoughts and attitudes and perspectives. Those are all created inside, dependent on my spiritual state. It's through the lens of my thoughts and attitudes and perspectives that I experience the outer world and even impact the outer world, shape it. But it begins deep inside my spiritual state. Om Shanti.
Om Shanti. Welcome to those who have joined with us this evening for part 2, Spirituality in Day-to-Day Life. So we have touched on topics basically with this foundation of awareness. And as mentioned last week, that for those who have not had a chance to see the previous sessions, it would be extremely helpful. So I know that last week we did mention a little bit about in different situations, should it be any different? And we always seem to keep returning to the basics of Raja Yoga. And on a day-to-day basis, And we often touch on this aspect of what do I use yoga for? What is yoga, again, for those who might not have taken Raj Yoga? But what is yoga for, and what does it have to do with day-to-day life?
I remember, and some have heard this story, I remember once I was in a computer training course. It was to train on a particular design software, and the function we were about to look at is called a Bezier tool, and it's meant to draw shapes in an art design program, but it's very finicky. Many try to avoid it if they can. It's quite finicky. And it's a bit counterintuitive. So just before the instructor is going to explain to us, instruct us on using this function, she paused and took a deep sigh. She says, before you use this tool, it's good to have yoga. Now, this wasn't a Raj Yoga course. She was not a student of Raj Yoga. So I was a little bit surprised because I don't think she was talking about, asanas and breathing. She said it's good to have some yoga. And it was just very shocking, but it was very accurate. And, others might say it's really good to have a lot of experience or expertise or skills, or we don't usually say it's good to have yoga. But this idea of what's happening in this thing called yoga, and yoga is this phenomena, I suppose, this experience where I am very much experiencing myself to be a soul, so a very eternal experience of the self, and I am connecting to the one who is always in a very pure, elevated state, the Supreme Soul, so the truth. So I'm really having a deep experience of what is eternal, what is true, and it has quite an impact. We know that we're deeply colored by different interactions, so this isn't unusual. But what happens when I'm interacting with the truth? What impact would that have? And it turns out it activates the wonderful capacities, spiritual capacities of the self, and neutralizes those things which are not us, but we feel have become our habits. So it's a very transformative thing in terms of what it activates in the soul. And so that's a silly little example with the Bezier tool. But when I look at as another, I think, more interesting example, the leaders, the spiritual leaders of the Brahma Kumari's World Spiritual University, they have zero training in a worldly sense, in administration or management of a multinational corporation, or no training whatsoever. And yet they provide incredible leadership simply by being yogi. And they're not avoiding things. Our classic, image of a yogi is often a cave in deep tapasya. They're not avoiding anything. They're very immersed in all their responsibilities, but they're doing it as yogis. So these examples of the impact spirituality has in unlocking the innate capacities of the self, which we try to do through worldly study or training, etc., worldly training, but it's quite interesting.
Just wanted to check in for those who are on Instagram. If you have any audio issues, make sure to let us know. We're assuming everything works on YouTube, but please let us know. We do have our eye on the chat box. So when you were sharing, actually, it might seem like it's a little bit of a digression, but something that happens on day-to-day life where we're always making decisions. And because it came up in a conversation today, what's the difference from what you were sharing about in terms of the leadership role of these souls who have no training, and just trying to think of the pros and cons to make decisions? Is there a difference?
There is. So, as spiritual beings, we have some physically. The physical body has these physical senses, the physical eyes, the physical ears, etc. Many of them are located here in the head. As spiritual beings, we also have these subtle or spiritual senses, the mind, the intellect, and the sanskars. And when it comes to decision making, ideally the intellect is the one that reasons, that's able to discern. But when we're going into pros and cons, and it's not that it's a bad thing to do, but we often want to think through a decision. So we're trying to use our mind to make the decision, which is not what it's designed to do. The intellect, ideally, is designed to make a decision. And the intellect doesn't think, the mind does that. The intellect can see or discern. So if it's a bit like the story of the chopping the cherry tree down. I can take 95% of my time making the blade of the axe really sharp so that it's down in one stroke. Or I can take a blunt instrument and very inefficiently keep hammering away at this tree. And it's messy. So what we do is we spend a lot of time making our intellect very refined and sharp, so it can immediately just see or feel or sense this is the accurate thing to do or not do. And it's not thinking it through, it just recognizes.
I guess it might not be necessarily a fair question, is how do I know if what I'm deciding on is really the right thing? This is all very invisible.
There's a couple of things that I use. One is, am I peaceful? And two is, would it be okay if it didn't happen immediately? Because what happens a lot in our decisions is they're driven by desires rather than wisdom. And when a decision is driven by desire, there's a restlessness to it and the sense of this has to happen now. I want it to happen now. So what if you make a decision and it doesn't happen, or it doesn't play out at that moment, or am I at peace with that? And I know it's tricky because it's, certain things with respect to self-progress we don't want to avoid. So there's a lot of honesty in all of this. We say, I'm not supposed to push anything through, and so I have to check if I'm being careless or slack or any of these things, of course. But what we're trying to see is that decision coming from the force of desire? Mm-hmm. And ultimately is what we're looking for. So I've noticed that when the intellect is involved, there's this incredible peace or calm, this almost dignity or maturity around it, and this feeling almost as if it is done. So I'm very respectful of the timing of it, but it is done. It's just accurate, so it will inevitably happen. When we say accurate, it means benevolent. So that's really what the drama moves along with, is benevolence. And when we don't do benevolent things, eventually, if we wait long enough, it will self-destruct.
So just stepping back a bit, because I think this is the tricky part about day-to-day situations or day-to-day life with spirituality. It's like, okay, well, I really want to do Raja Yoga because I want to make sure that benevolent things happen. So stepping back, what is this all about? What is this the greater picture for?
Yeah, I think more and more we are so globally connected. So when we say what's the most benevolent thing to happen, And, on a global level, or the big picture, we just want peace and happiness for all souls. That's the big picture. But it's a very messy world right now. So how is, and I think this is interesting, because when we look at day-to-day life, we tend to look at just our own life and get very absorbed in our own life and not realize how interconnected we are, that there is a big picture at play. So spirituality helps us to break things down to their very basic building blocks. What is the one thing I need to focus on so that there is benevolent things happening, not just in my individual life, but in the bigger picture too? What is that one thing? And spirituality helps me. So then I know I actually don't even have to decide anything. It actually is telling me this is what you need to focus on in all situations. And of course, that one thing is purity.
How does that help me then to sort of take that big picture in terms of what's happening? Because it was a lovely question that had came, a request for this particular topic. Because, and I know we touched on it last week, it's like this whole big picture aspect. And I'm at work, and there seems to be something that might be missing where I'm struggling with seeing the big picture.
We, time and again, it's our own attachments and fears and insecurities, etc. Desires is huge, that pulls us into the minutiae, and we get lost in the minutiae and completely kind of disconnect from the big picture. It literally blinds us, these different forces. But if we can sort of pull out, if we have, and that's what spirituality is trying to give us, a mechanism, a body of information that enables us to pull out of the force of all of those things that are pulling us into the minutiae, the details. If we can pull out, then we're able to make decisions that aren't being driven by those forces, and it's far less confusing. I always find it interesting in organizations, being in meetings where they're trying to make decisions, and it's like, what's the financial impact, and what's the bottom line, and where will the resources go? In other words, these different forces of desire and attachment, and this is the way we've always done, etc. But the minute that someone says, but what's our core values? The minute someone says that, the decision's very clear. It's absolutely clear. So once we introduce purity and become free, we're reconnecting again with the point, the big picture.
Can you clarify a little bit more, explain a little bit more when you say once we introduce purity?
Yeah, with spirituality, purity, if we look at purity in its most basic technical definition, something is pure when there's nothing foreign mixed in. So, and we know that when we see a product that is described as pure, it is usually selling for a higher amount. So there's a deep connection between purity and value. So when something's pure, it is of greater value. We know that about objects and things. Well, it turns out the same applies to living beings. That when we are in a pure state, that is our intrinsic nature, is operating with nothing foreign mixed in, things that aren't us, aren't operating, then there's great value in our lives. We're able to operate through values. We feel more valuable about ourselves. We're able to contribute value. Valuable outcomes happen. Everything becomes valuable when we are operating in a pure way. So the debate begins when we talk about what is the innate, what is that innate state? When you say to people, what is human nature? We're really talking about the innate state. That's where the debate begins. Some will argue, say that, conflict, anger, desire, these are human nature. And spirituality is suggesting, be very quiet, very honest. When you get angry at someone, how do you feel? And very often we say, I feel great. And so that's, really having to be honest and quiet inside, because usually what happens is there's a lot of rationalization. Why I had to get angry. I start to rationalize. And that's a sign. Whenever we rationalize, it's a sign that we are not at peace with what just happened. We're really trying to defend or explain why we behaved that way. So that's really the core issue that needs to be resolved, is what is that innate state? Now, what Raj Yoga is suggesting is our innate state is free of anger and greed and lack of self-respect and desire and all of these elements that we see rampant in the world today and really driving our decisions. So we're left with what our innate state is peaceful, loveful, truthful, joyful, harmonious, peaceful, pure. This is our innate state. So then our decisions are being driven by these values. And what kind of life would that create? So that's what we're looking at. That's the big picture.
It's interesting you're sharing, because when you were speaking, I was thinking about this phrase that everyone actually cares a lot about. It's quality of life. Mm-hmm. And it comes up maybe not even consciously or even something you have to verbalize, but it matters to so many. What does this all mean in terms of quality of life? Because that, I think, becomes the question. What determines quality of life?
It's interesting.
In terms of Raj Yoga.
Yeah. It's really a big big thing that we've started to connect quantity with value, rather than quality with value. I say that loosely because when I go to buy, if someone's going to buy a product in the store, they're going to say, no, I want quality. I definitely want quality. But when it comes to our own decisions, etc., it's almost like an addiction. We almost can't seem to stop ourselves. That if I can get something through quantity, I will. And I was just before this session preparing for a workshop that's coming up, and it's on a particular type of fitness class. And I was reading some of the stuff out there on this particular class, and I found it really interesting because it was completely disconnected from the pure origins that particular class is based on, and it was so quantity focused, doing really strange things for quantity. Whether it's muscular development or whatever the case, but for quantity. And I was like, that has nothing to do, like in terms of quality of just physical quality of moving through the day, it won't enhance the capacity of the body in terms of osteoporosis, all these, it won't help going after quantity, but it will stroke the ego. Right? So that's our challenge, is am I feeding something we call impure pride, or am I nurturing pure pride? And that's our big dilemma when it comes to quantity versus quality of life. And this is when decisions become difficult. Mm-hmm. It's this battle between ego and self-respect.
So regarding that aspect, then, do we perhaps maybe have a rather distorted idea of what self-respect means then?
I will say only for myself that I had no idea what self-respect was. I knew it was important. I knew there were many books on it, but I was very much seeking to understand. Because I think if we just sort of think it through logically, self-respect is a state where my sense of worth and value is completely independent of anything out there, right? It's an internal state. It travels with me regardless of whether I have this position or know that person or own this. I mean, that's, once we start to, it's moved into external validation. So that's as far as I got, is that self-respect is not going to have anything to do with external validation. Mm-hmm. But then I say, wow, how's that going to happen? It seems that every way we have defined ourselves is based on something external, even the body. So that's, before Raj Yoga, that's as far as I got. After Raj Yoga, things became very clear.
Mm-hmm. Now this aspect then of what self-respect is, back to day-to-day life, if there was real self-respect, if I can really have this global awareness, is it really possible to be able to still just conduct my life in day-to-day situations? I still have roles and responsibilities in different situations at work, relationships.
Yeah, so when souls ask about this, because spirituality really developed a reputation of being separate from day-to-day life. I go off to the jungle, or I go to an ashram, or I go to some sanctuary, and then I have to go back to real life. Mm-hmm. That's kind of the reputation spirituality got. But if we're understanding spirituality as this very pure state of self-respect, the suggestion is spirituality would enhance your day-to-day life rather be separate from it. What it's suggesting is, I'm now going to move through all my roles and responsibilities, interactions and actions in a state of self-respect, or a pure state. It sounds great, actually. So it's an enhancement of day-to-day life rather than separate from.
It's so interesting we have these conversations, and it seems like it can be pretty easy to sort of forget the point again and again. Is it habits then?
I think one thing that happens is we're so used to trying to do so many things with techniques, and not ever kind of getting to the seed, but just sort of these different techniques, kind of patching things together. And so even when people come to the Raj Yoga course, they say, I want the technique. And it can be a little bit frustrating. We give a method, but not a technique. And we're using the terms very specifically because I could sort of kind of have some sort of technique, but it doesn't actually in any way involve spirituality in the sense of experiencing myself to be a spirit. Which is the foundation of spirituality. So I'm using a technique which is trying to simulate that experience, but isn't the experience itself. So, for example, when I am experiencing myself to be a soul, then I use all the resources in a very efficient and gentle and peaceful way. It happens really naturally. Now, I could develop techniques to simulate that, where I count from 10 as I'm doing something, or I make sure that I follow all the rules of recycling, or whatever. I could use a lot, but I'm
not. Try not to step on
so
people's toes.
It looks like I'm living a spiritual life, but there's no spirituality involved in the sense of it's coming from experiencing myself to be a spirit. Again, when I do, these capacities are naturally unlocked. So it's when we talk about day-to-day life, this is a caution that I might try and apply techniques that seem to mimic spirituality without actually including spirituality at all, and giving the chance, having the courage, the patience to, again, and the reason we do that is because we're desiring certain outcomes. We're back to that old formula, but giving myself a chance to actually use spirituality in day-to-day life rather than techniques that are mimicking spirituality in day-to-day life. That's what I really have to check.
It's very interesting in terms of method versus technique, and I know we're not talking about semantics here.
Mm-hmm.
In terms of just helping to clarify more about what that means, does it have to do with like what is my overarching awareness of myself in terms of trying to access these experiences versus, as you're using more technique, if you could perhaps maybe, I don't know if you think of a physical example that might make this easier to understand.
Mm.
I might be putting you on the spot.
Yeah, no, it's fine. I think in the way we're using it here, it's almost a little bit outside in versus inside out, a little bit. So, I'm trying to think of an example in physical exercise, in terms of simulating a certain result through a technique versus actually doing the thing from the accurate place.
May I?
Mm-hmm.
There was one example. I don't know if this is actually relevant, but there was a time when you were trying to do something, and the instructor and you said, "Tell me how to do this," and they were telling you just believe in yourself or something like that. I don't know if that is at all relevant. Maybe you have to explain that because I don't think I did a very good job, and maybe that's not a great example.
I know that the example that actually was coming to me, it's a little bit weird, and I don't know if it's a perfect connection to what we're talking about, but I know many are familiar with The Karate Kid, and there's a lot going on in that film, in that story, where we have a unhappy boy who very angry and wants certain things to happen, is quite focused on what needs to happen, basically wants to beat everybody. He wants to learn this art so that he can have this control and this power over others. And the funny thing is that he lands up in the hands of someone who can really see, who has a good intellect, who can see the potential for good in that boy, rather than just the anger and the frustration. And so he knows that his whole intention is to unlock the potential for good. That's what the instructor's intent is. And he has to figure out a method to make that happen. And so there's this sort of guise that he's teaching the boy karate. And what I love about the wax on, wax off scene where he's going to clean his car, so the boy is going to clean his master, the instructor's car, and the boy is saying, tell me the techniques, tell me how to do this martial art. Just give me the technique. That's all he wants from the master. But the master, and the reason I'm saying is we've got two layers going on when we talk about method and technique, and it's so related to outcome. When we say spirituality in everyday life, the bottom line is everybody wants to be happy, peaceful and happy, but we're so attached to our feeling of how that's supposed to happen. And we want techniques that are connected to our vision of how that's supposed to happen. And the way that's supposed to happen is that everything out there goes the way I want. So give me techniques to make everything out there go the way I want. So for example, they'll come and say, make my mind powerful so that I can have these powerful thoughts that create the outcomes I want. Right? So we're talking about that this morning. And so there's two parts to it, I guess. And so Raj Yoga kind of unpacks that and says, okay, yes, peaceful and happy, absolutely. But you're a little bit off on how to arrive at that state, so the technique that you're asking for is also off.
And so, the technique would be hit and miss, or that it's just not really relevant to what you're really doing?
It's not going to get you to peace and happiness. It's just not going to get you there. So there's sort of this surrender that has to happen where, okay, fine, I need to be clear on what peace and happiness is about. And we learn it's about purity. And then, okay, now what's the method to become pure? So now I'm not interested in techniques of how to make things happen out there. All I care about is I want the method to become pure.
Become real.
Yeah. And then I know everything out there will be sorted out. So it's kind of almost making the question a little bit moot, if you will. And it's I know this came up recently as we had a new student coming into the study, and we have a text that we look at every morning that helps us to understand spirituality and the method, what we need to do. But there's two things people do with that document. One, some come to it and wait to hear answers to address different situations going on in their day-to-day life. Many use the document that way.
It answers my questions.
And others come to it with just one focus. I'm using this document to know how to become pure, because if I become that, everything is included in that. So we want a method to become pure, not techniques. I like
your example more than what I was suggesting.
No, that's okay. Rather than techniques on how to do this, that, or the other thing, I just want a method to become pure.
It's a great example, because I think that sometimes souls are trying to, I don't understand what you mean by method versus technique. It's like trying to really be able to assess the self of what's really happening.
I don't think we'd ever use the language, I want the technique to become pure. It just doesn't make any sense. It's just a strange sentence, rather than I want to know how to become pure. Right? I want to know how to become pure. So, again, kind of going back to the big picture, what is the overarching destination?
It seems like it's very related to when you were sharing about this workshop. If it's just about, let's say, what do you call it, muscle development. But at the end of the day, physically speaking, we want these bodies to be healthy. So it seems like in spirituality we kind of, again, forget and lose access to who and what we really are. So then we start having conversations about technique. I
think if we fall in love, if we really get to know what purity is, it gives us an opportunity to really develop such a great relationship. And when we say purity means self-respect, for, in terms of the self, purity means respect for others. Purity means being a steward for the elements. Once we know this is what purity actually means when it hits the ground, then we start to develop a great appreciation for it.
Well, I think we are running out of time, but it's very thought-provoking, and hopefully if souls have any questions about this aspect about spirituality and day-to-day life, you're welcome to email the center. If you have topics that you would like to explore, you can also let us know as well. So I guess we'll have a little reflection, and what the topic is next week, I guess it'll be a surprise for all of us.
As so often I might do when I sit in reflection, I bring the image of a tree into my mind. The part of the tree that's above the ground, that's visible, in a way, represents my day-to-day life. The different limbs of my day-to-day life, different roles, responsibilities, relationships. And of course, we want all of those different limbs to be healthy and flourishing and bearing fruit. The tree stands on a single trunk, and that trunk, that connects to the ground and what is beneath the surface, the roots and the seed. The trunk carries the nourishment from what is underground through the entire tree. I could spend my time trying to address the different leaves, the different limbs, one by one, and trying to take care of the very aspects of my life. But if I want a fully healthy tree, I eventually have to go below ground. Look at the state of the seed, look at the state of the roots, ensure that they're properly feeding all the aspects of my life through the trunk. The seed, of course, is awareness of the self. I, the being, the one living this life. And that's protected by a system of core values. Taking time to explore these aspects, making sure they're peaceful, they're healthy, content, fully developed. If I focus there, automatically, all the aspects of my day-to-day life will be nourished and nurtured and thrive automatically. Just taking care of those invisible bits underground, the seed and the roots, and ensuring they're well integrated through the trunk into my day-to-day life. Om Shanti.
Om Shanti. Well, thank you for all who have joined with us this evening. And so we are now almost partway through October. Judy, what's coming up?
Things are coming up. Many, many things. So I believe our website is up to date. So there is a workshop on authenticity that I believe is on October 30th. Is that correct? 31st at 5 o'clock. So October 31st on Halloween, we have in English a workshop on authenticity of the self. Authenticity within. So that will be available on Zoom and YouTube. See, I'm totally making this up. Okay. So please check our website. I know it's there, and then you can register and know everything that's going on with the proper information. Our drop-in meditation English continues. We also have it in Hindi on Wednesday and Thursday evenings from 6:30 to 7:30 p.m., I believe. But again, that's on our website. And we also, so the drop-in meditations, and also we have the Soul Cafe that is Saturdays from 2 to 3 on Zoom and streamed to YouTube. So that information is on our website as well. So please do check there for all the details on those courses and more. And thank you for joining this session. Om Shanti. Yeah, the one more thing. So some of you might choose to come on site to our Northeast Center. And we are implementing, along with all the other BK centers in Canada, a national vaccine policy. So if you're coming on site to our physical centers, you will have to be vaccinated. And that is also explained fully on our website. It's off the main page, the home page. But if you have any questions, please do email us, and we're happy to help out. All right, Om Shanti.